Created in the apocalyptic fires of the Vermin Doom, with the distinction of being the chief priest of the Horned Rat, Lord of the Gnaw, and master of the mind-shattering Death Frenzy, and he just so happens to be an absolutely epic model. Join me as I show you how to paint Vizzik Skour, the Prophet of the Horned Rat, a fantastically epic centerpiece model. A huge thank you to Gamesworks for sending me the model early. We really can't delay because this is an epic piece and it needs an epic paint job. So let's dive right in. To make painting that much easier, I've left off the head and I'll paint that separately. I have mounted it much like I'm sure a Stormcast would like to mount it on a separate pin and painting handle. I've then primed the whole thing black. So let's get started, and we're going to do all of the flesh first, and we're going to start with some Bugman's Glow. Now I'm using one of my Artist Opus Series D dry brushes for this, so I've got very little on the brush, and I'm just going to stipple this all over the flesh areas. And whilst I'm doing the main body of the model, I'm also going to be doing the head as well. So just work your way across until you've got a decent solid coat of Bugman's Glow. Next up, I'm going to carry on doing the same technique using some Cadian Felshtone. Now, generally, I am going to look to cover all of the flesh at the same time, but I may leave some areas that are in particularly dark shadows, not worry about getting my brush in there too deeply. One of those cases in point is the chest, which has got all that armour covering it. I'm only going to do the bits I can reach. I'm not going to go over and out of my way to try and get all of the chest painted with this Cadian Felshtone. I'm going to start to refine the highlight on all of the flesh now, and the colour I'm using for that is Kislev Flesh. So again, we're just working our way up through the flesh colours. I'm still stippling, but I'm very much focusing on those areas catching the most light now. Particular things like the face, the hands, and the front of the leg there, the knee area. Not worrying too much about those darker parts in the recesses. I'm then going to follow that up with some Flayed One Flesh, and we're really focusing on those areas that are catching the most light now. So we're leaving all the shadows in the recesses. Again, I'm using the same brush that I've been using with the Kislev Flesh, so the paint will mix a little bit on the brush, and again, that'll just help smooth that transition and that blend as we go through it. So just catch those areas you think will be brightest. I'm then going to take some Pallid Witch Flesh, which is a much brighter flesh colour, and I'm going to use this fairly sparingly, but I'm going to focusing on all those areas that are lighter based on what's on the box art. So I'm still stippling, but generally here I'm just focusing on things like the hands and a little bit on the face to add some of that lightness. You can also work this across the back over those scarred areas. Now the tail transitions from a fleshy colour to a kind of dark, blistery, purpley colour. So to do that, we're going to take some pink horror and we're going to start stippling all the way up the tail, just blending it nicely into those fleshy colours. Now, if you do go too far, then you can obviously take a little bit of Kislev Flesh to blend them back together. A top tip here is to use the bracelets on the tail to hide some of those transitions, so it looks a little bit smoother than it actually is. We'll continue building up that purpley colour with some Screamer Pink, and again, exactly the same way as we've done everything else so far on the model. We're stippling it on there, and we're getting a nice blend transition from that pink horror into the Screamer Pink, where it's going to be darkest at the tip of the tail. Next up, I'm going to shade all of the flesh down. Now, we will go back in and add some more highlights later, but first off, I'm going to take some Magos Purple. I'm going to mix this with a little bit of contrast medium and paint it all over the flesh. This is going to give a little bit of warmth back to it and also give the impression that there's a little bit of life in it, even though this is quite a demonic model. It's just something to have in there that helps us add yet more interest. Otherwise, we're going to have quite wide areas of bright flesh that don't really do anything for us. Now, I'm painting this across all of the areas into the recesses around the fur. The one thing I'm going to say is to just be careful that you don't let it pool too heavily in any of the recesses, because we don't want deep purple, not the band, the colouring, and we just want to make sure that we've got a nice glaze across the area just to give a hint of a warmer colour. For the tail, we need to make this a little bit darker, so I'm going with some dark tone from Army Painter. You can use Nuln Oil if you've got that, and I'm going to use Nuln Oil later on in the project as well. But just for this one, I'm using that dark tone, which just works quite nicely. Once it's dried, I'm just going to add a second coat towards the tip. So from that bracelet with the bell up, just put a second coat on there to darken it down a bit more. We'll get started on the metallics next. So first up, we'll do some silver. Now I'm using dark aluminium for this. There isn't a huge amount across the model. Generally, it's just going to be things like the chainmail and maybe some of the detail on the base. Now, I always do the base last, but I have used it on there. And the only other major area is that sword blade. We'll paint all of the brass areas as well before we shade it, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Balthasar Gold. Now, there's plenty of bits to do with this. There's loads of bits that I completely forgot to do the first time around, so I went back in and finished them. I'm talking about the little shield and emblems, tokens that are all across the bottom of the skirt that Vizzik is wearing. There's also bits on his head, little trinkets, and all of the bells. So make sure you do them as well as the armour panels across the chest. We'll then shade all of the silver and the brassy colours using that dark tone from Army Painter. Now, I've said before, I use the dark tone because I find that it is a lot stronger than the Nuln Oil. It works its way into the recesses. The downside with it is it can be a little bit glossy, which when you're using on armour is fine, but on clothing is probably not the best. Now, if you haven't got this, you can absolutely use Nuln Oil. Just pop 2 coats on. When that's completely dry, I'm going to take some Coelia Greenshade and paint this all over the brass areas. Now, this is just going to give a rough, dark effect, as there's a little bit of verdigris building up in some areas on the armour. And it gives them a little bit of a greeny tinge, which is great because we're going to add a little bit more detail to it later on as we go through it. And it's just going to build up all of the texture on this model. I want to add a little bit of rust to some of the silver areas, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Skrag Brown. So all I've done is put a little bit on my palette and thinned it down quite a lot with water, so it's very runny. Then all you need to do is just touch your brush along those areas where you want it, and it'll just run into the recesses. I'm putting this generally along some of the bits of chainmail, and I'm also going to stipple it across the sword in some areas, just to give it a rough and worn look. Next up, it's time to highlight all of the brassy areas, and the colour I'm using for this is Sycorax Bronze. Now, I'm being very rough with this highlight. I'm dragging it across edges where I can, but generally I'm just stippling it across, giving it a little bit of a battered highlight, which just fits in quite nicely with the battered elements of the armour. If you do make any mistakes with this, you can always go back in with a little bit of the Balthasar Gold just to tidy it up a touch. Finally, I'll take some Canoptek Alloy and I'll just drag this along those sharp edges just to help them pop and stand out from the model. I'm then going to add a slightly stronger verdigris effect in by taking some Nihilakh Oxide and just running this into those deepest recesses, particularly where you've got angular elements, and only putting a little bit in. If you put too much in, then just clean your brush off and wipe it up. It's better to put a little and add more rather than flood the area, because this needs to be a subtle effect. I do a little bit of highlighting on the silver, and the colour I'm using for this is back to that dark aluminium. Generally, I'm just going to focus this on the sword, and I'm just looking to highlight the edges by dragging the brush and also stippling it along those edges to give a really worn metallic effect. This is a nice simple step. Again, little is better. You can always add more. Just to help me see how the model was coming together, I went back in and tidied up some of the areas with some black paint, just so I could see how things were looking, rather than have all that fleshy colour splotched everywhere. It was then time to paint the skin skirt. I think it's a skin skirt, I'm not entirely sure, but the box art shows it's grey, like a warm grey, so that's what we're going to go for. And the colour I'm going to use for this is Skaven Blight Dinge, which doesn't cover particularly well. However, that'll help us because it'll help us add some shading to it later on without having to worry too much about using washes. So just get this done, a nice solid coat. Probably takes 2 or 3 coats of Skaven Blight Dinge. Just make sure you get all the bits of the cloth that you need to, including the bits that are underneath, behind some of the areas, and also the folded over parts over the belt. Once I'd got those 2 coats and had a very, very nice overall opaque coverage of Skaven Blight Dinge, I took some Storm Vermin Fur and I mixed a 50-50 mix of Storm Vermin Fur and Skaven Blight Dinge. And I started to highlight, but as you can see here, I'm highlighting big areas of that skirt. I'm not doing edge highlighting, I'm doing quite a lot of area highlighting, leaving that pure Skaven Blight Dinge in the recesses. And this is what's going to help us to build up those highlight layers without having to worry about any washes. For the next step, I was using pure Storm Vermin Fur, and I was working this across the same sort of areas, but when I did come to folds, I was really starting to focus on those raised areas, leaving the other colours in the recesses. Now, remember I said earlier, these colours don't cover particularly well, and that's great because you can start to build up transitions with layers, and because they blend into the previous layer as they dry, it just gives you a little bit of an easier time of things when it comes to these highlights. As I started to focus on some of the highlighted areas, I then mixed a 50-50 mix of Karak Stone and Storm Vermin Fur, and this started to push me towards the highlight colour I wanted. Generally, I wanted to keep this along those areas that I wanted to be highlighted. So we're looking at things like the folds, also paint it along the top of some of those indentations and rips and seam marks, because that just helps accentuate them and highlight them. So when you're looking at it from a distance, you can still see the detail. The last highlight I did was with pure Karak Stone, and this was a very thin highlight, and this was painted inside the previous layers. So this is where you get the sharpness of the highlights. In some areas you can drag the brush, in other areas you just need to be a little bit more careful. And one of the benefits of this technique is that if you do make any mistakes, you should still have the previous mixes on your palette, so it's really easy to just pick them up on your brush again, paint them over and get that nice smooth transition back. On to the shoulder pad armour. So first off, I took that black paint and made sure that they were covered and there weren't any other outstanding colours on there, such as those fleshy colours from earlier. And then I started to stipple on some Action Grey. Now, this is a very dark grey, and this works really nicely for this step. So generally, I'm focusing on the areas that are going to catch the most light, leaving the darker colours in some of the recesses. Now, the box art does a good job of demonstrating this effect, so if you're not sure, just have a look at it. I then started building up with some Dawnstone. This is using the same brush, so there's still a little bit of that Action Grey in there, which means they mix together on the brush, so it doesn't make that transition too harsh. I just stippled this across the areas inside the Action Grey of the previous step, focusing towards the edges that are going to catch all of the light. Finally, I used a little bit of Administratum Grey to do the same thing, so that I got that nice dark to light transition. There's very little paint on the brush at this point. Again, it's exactly the same brush. To finish up, I did a little bit of edge highlighting with Administratum Grey. Now, because in the previous step you would have had a mix of greys in the brush, this Administratum Grey isn't a massive step forward in terms of value, but it does help to outline those panels really nicely and give you a nice effect on them. And I'm really happy actually with how these armour panels have turned out, because it's quite subtle, but you can definitely see it's there. To finish up, I used that same rust wash that I'd used on the armour, which is just some very thin Skrag Brown paint, dropped into the recesses and where you've got dents and nicks in the armour, just to show that it's weathering over time. Next up, we're going to paint the scarf, and I'm calling it a scarf for want of a better term. There may be other words out there, but to all intents and purposes, it is a scarf. So I didn't want to do a red one, I thought I'd do a green one, which is a bit more muted. So to do this, I based the whole thing using Castellan Green. Now, green paints in general don't cover fantastically well, but remember, that's to our advantage, because it means that we can help to get some transition just as we build the layers up. So it did take me 2 coats of the Castellan Green to get a nice even coverage across all of the scarf. To balance it out and get a rough idea of what the other side of the scarf would look like, I based all of that using Steel Legion Drab. Again, this took 2 coats, it did take 3 in some areas. And the main reason I did this was, yes, it frames it, but also if I was going to make any mistakes with the Steel Legion Drab colour, it's better to do them now before I do any detail work on the scarf. And that's what I did. So once I'd got the Steel Legion Drab down, I went back in with Castellan Green and just corrected any issues and overspills I'd made. Now it was time to shade the model. Now, you could just whack a wash in here, but I think that would be an ineffective way, because this is quite a big area, very similar to how we did the skirt. So what I decided to do is just take a little bit of Caliban Green and paint this into the recesses. Where I had big areas of recesses, what I did was just wash my brush off and just feather out the edge of that Caliban Green while it was still wet. And this blended it and feathered it a little bit into the colour underneath. And if you need to, you can go back in and work it back forth with the Caliban Green. If you need to, you go back in with the Castellan Green, and it should work absolutely fine as well. You could potentially mix a little bit of black paint in with the Castellan Green and use that as a shade, but I wanted to use a green just to keep it a little bit more vivid than if I'd done that way, which probably would have desaturated it a bit. So on to the highlights. I did these in a very similar way to how I did the shade. So I took some Loren Forest and painted this towards those raised areas. I then cleaned my brush off and feathered it back into the Castellan Green underneath. This helped give me a nice smooth transition. Now, this green again doesn't cover particularly well, so using that to my advantage, you just build up the layers where you need the brighter highlight, leaving a little bit of a transition behind you as you go. The last highlight was with some Straken Green, and we just kept this along those sharp edges. So where we can, we pulled it along the creases to give us a nice crisp highlight, and generally we just wanted to build it up smoothly. If we did make any mistakes, we just took some of the previous colours to tone them down a little bit. because in the next step, we're going to do quite a bit of freehand. So for the freehand, I'm not going to overcomplicate things with this. I'm using some Zandri dust, and all I'm doing is painting lines. So we've got the benefit of following the box art. Now, I'm not going to do all of the runes that are on the scarf and the box art. I'm just going to do a few select ones, particularly these big ones around the shoulders. So like I said, all I'm doing is drawing lines and joining them up, making basic shapes. If you need to thicken some of the lines, you can do that, and always have in the back of your mind that as you're doing this, any mistakes can be corrected. You can always paint back over them with some of the green. And you'll see as I start to put these down, some of the strokes are a little bit rough, some of the lines are a little bit rough. That's easily correctable just by taking some green paint from the previous step and painting it over. So whilst you want to be as accurate as possible at this stage, it isn't the be-all and end-all, but I would encourage it. So there you can see I've put quite a few of these markings on there. The bits that go around the fold in the cloak are a little bit ropey, so they are going to need a little bit of refinement, which I'll do off camera. What we then need to do is start highlighting them. So I'm going to use Ushabti Bone for this, and what I'm looking to do is leave that Zandri dust in the recesses and paint the rest of it with the Ushabti Bone. And this will give you a nice transition that you don't have to work too hard to get. And if you want to blend the transition, then by all means go ahead and do it. I'm not going to, because I don't think I need it. I think the folds give us enough in terms of how we get a little bit of variation across this colour. So as we've got the Zandri dust out, let's have a look at the horns on this particular horny horned rat. Try and say that 5 times fast. And all we're going to do is paint probably the first half of all of the horns using the Zandri dust. Now, generally, this will need 2 to 3 coats to cover completely. I'm then going to take a brown colour. Now, I'm using Dryad Bark, and I'm going to paint the majority of the rest of the horn this colour, butting it up nicely to that Zandri dust. Now, you might think, hang on, doesn't this need to be transitioned? We are going to transition it. We're going to use wet blending for that. Don't worry, it's not that complicated. You can go back and forth and you can fix it easily enough. But just in order to get that wet blend, we need to have the 2 colours that we want to blend together already down side by side. So to start the blending process, I'm going to pop some Zandri dust down over that Dryad Bark in the transition zone. I'm going to clean my brush off, and then I'm going to add some more Dryad Bark on, and I'm going to just paint them into each other. Now you can see this looks a little bit messy on the model. That's absolutely fine. We can always go back in and fix it later on. We can use shading, we can use highlighting to hide some things as well. But generally, I'm just going to go back and forth, either adding more Zandri dust if I want it to be lighter, or more Dryad Bark if I want the transition to be a little bit darker, or move back down that Zandri dust a bit. First off, we're going to shade all of the areas we've just blended together. And the colour I'm using for this is Strong Tone from Army Painter, which is a brown wash. Now, if you haven't got this, you can use something like Agrax Earth Shade. That should work absolutely fine as well. Again, what I'm focusing on doing is working this into the recesses, but making sure I don't have any major pooling spots as it dries. And by painting this across the Zandri dust, the transition and the Dryad Bark, it should start to tie things together. Then before that dries, I can take some of the dark tone wash and paint this over the rest of the Dryad Bark areas, and as it dries, it'll start to mix in with that brown wash as well. This is just, again, helping that transition across the model. I'm going to start highlighting the horns, and the first colour I use for that is, of course, Zandri dust. And generally to do this, I'm looking to highlight most of the horn area. As I come to that transition though, rather than highlighting the area of the horn, I'm going to start to highlight the edges. So I'm going to drag the brush along the top of it, probably into most of that brown area, because we can always paint over it later on with a Gothor brown highlight on the brown itself. And again, that's just going to help ease the transition. So just keep working it back. Again, don't have too much on your brush, and it's better to start off sparingly and then go back in and add more than it is to go in too thick. Then I'm going to take that Gothor brown and extend that highlight across the brown parts of the horns towards the black parts of the horns. Now, it's important when you do this that, again, very similar to the previous step, you don't have too much on your brush, because it's very easy to spill Gothor brown everywhere. So again, just focus on the sharp raised edges and use the tip of your brush. I then use some Eshin Grey on the horns in exactly the same way that I've been highlighting everything so far, just dragging it back across the end to the tips, focusing on the sharp parts. Now, as we're coming to the sharp end of the horns here, you're going to have a lot more rigidity across the model to actually drag the brush and get that crisp highlight. I then drag Dawnstone, focusing on the tips of the horns to get that nice bright highlight, which just gives the impression that they're really sharp on the edge as well. And I highlighted some of the ridges just to help them stand out. Going back to the lighter part of the horn now, I'm going to take some Ushabti Bone, and again I'm going to highlight quite a bit of the horns at this stage, leaving the Xandri dust only in those recesses. And then when I do come to that Gothor Brown part, I'm just going to drag the brush a little bit into the Gothor Brown, again just giving a highlight and helping ease that transition slightly. The last highlight across the horns is with Wraith Bone, which is a nice bright bone colour. I'm using this fairly sparingly, only on the really sharp points. This is really going to help it stand out and give the impression of sharpness. So as we move on to painting all of the hair and the fur on Vizzik, we're going to start off on the beard. Now I'm going to take a little bit of Black Templar contrast paint and just stipple this towards the top. I'm then going to take some Garaghak Sewr contrast paint and paint the rest of the beard. And this is going to blend into the Black Templar at the top as well. I'm going to cover the rest of the fur using Garaghak Sewr. But one thing I am going to do is once I've got it down there, before it dries, I'm going to clean my brush off. I'm then going to dip it into contrast medium and feather the edges. And this is going to mimic that box art where you've got the darker hair towards the back, and as it comes towards the flesh, the hair is a lot lighter. Now, be careful with this because you can run the risk of it just running off the model. So again, if you do this, just make sure you take a clean brush and you can mop it up very quickly and very easily. I'm then going to take the Black Templar contrast paint to paint all of the horns and barbs on the tail and also any spiky bits that we might find across the model. This is just a nice easy way of basing them quite quickly. To highlight the beard, I'm firstly going to take a little bit of Mournfang Brown on a dry brush, and I'm just going to pull this down towards where I want the lightness to be. Now generally I'm not going to do too much of this across the rest of the model, so I'm going to focus it on the beard. And all I'm doing is catching those raised edges and ridges, but I'm not worrying too much if I go a little bit heavy towards the bottom. Next up, I'll take some Deathclaw Brown and do exactly the same thing just to get a lighter brown highlight on all of these areas. And it's worth saying again, I'm using the same brush, so they are mixing a little bit on the brush. Lastly, I'm going to take a little bit of Ushabti Bone, again on exactly the same brush, so it is going to mix into the Deathclaw Brown from the previous stage. And I'm just going to highlight right towards the bottom, so it gives a nice lightness to that beard, or bit of fur, I suppose, that he's got going on there. Next, I'm going to paint all of the little bits of straps and bands across the model, and the colour reason for this is Dawnstone. So we've got all the little bits across the horns which hold all of the trinkets on. We've also got the wraps on the sword handle and, of course, on that amazing Staff of Doom. Now I'm going to shade all of these using Nuln Oil. You can use the dark tone if you've got that. The truth is I ran out of it, so I'm just going to use Nuln Oil to shade these. If you don't think it's dark enough, then you can always add a second coat of Nuln Oil once it's dry. I'm then going to go back in with Dawnstone and start to highlight these areas, leaving that Nuln Oil in the recesses. Now, where you've got the bandages, this is fairly easy and fairly straightforward. Make sure you've got a good tip on your brush and you haven't got too much paint on there. You can afford to be a little bit rough here if you need to be. You can always put some more Nuln Oil in just to bring back some of that shading. The last highlight is with Administratum Grey, which is a nice bright grey. We've used it before on the model. And again, we're really focusing just on the edges here. So I'm looking to drag the brush across the shape of the model as much as I possibly can. This gives me that nice crisp highlight. Again, if you do make any mistakes, don't worry. You can just go back and use some of the Dawnstone from the previous step to tidy up. Now, if you haven't already, use some Black Templar to cover the horns on Vizzik's head. The two small ones that he's got starting to grow, not the big ones that we've already finished. And we're going to use the same grey, so we're going to use a little bit of Dawnstone just to highlight it. And then we're going to use a little bit of Administratum Grey just to add some sharpness to them. Now, it's really easy to go overboard and make these horns look completely grey. So if you need to, just go back in and use some Black Templar contrast paint just to bring back some of the recess shading on there. It's time for painting the staff and also highlighting the underside of the scarf. So the colour I'm going to use for this is Baneblade Brown. Now, Baneblade Brown, in my experience, has absolutely horrendous coverage, but that's fine. It's going to work to our advantage a little bit. So we're going to paint all of the staff, and we're going to paint the insides of the scarf, but only the bits we can really see. I'm not too concerned about going in and getting every little bit of detail, because in reality, you can't see it, and it's going to be darker and in shadow anyway. Now, it did take me 3 coats of Baneblade Brown on the staff, but that's fine. I'm going to go in and start to highlight it using Karak Stone. Now, you'll notice here I'm putting in some quite chunky highlights, and that's fine because we're going to shade it next, and the shade is what's going to give us that greeny, rotten wood colour that you can see on the box art. So as I'm working this Karak Stone across, I'm generally painting in lines. I'm generally following the grain of the wood. I'm also going to use this on the inside of the scarf, the underside of the scarf, to highlight the areas that are going to catch the most light. To get that rotted wood effect, we're going to take some Athonian camo shade and paint it all over the staff. Now, this is a really easy and straightforward thing to do. The skill is making sure that you don't flood the staff with the Athonian camo shade so that you can end up with it dripping off the bottom and really disgusting, ugly, greeny brown pools of this. So just put it on fairly lightly, not a huge amount on your brush. And don't forget to do the top parts of the staff as well around some of those wraps. When that's completely dry, we're going to start highlighting, and the colour we're going to use that is, again, Karak Stone. What we're looking to do is make sure we've got a good tip on our brush, and we're looking to drag it along the staff where we can. Now, we can't always do this, so just make sure you've got a good tip on your brush and paint in downward strokes so that you can reinstate some of that wood grain. And if there's no wood grain sculpted there, you can give the impression of it just by adding these lines across it. And you'll see there's some runes embedded in the staff. I'm going to paint all of these using the Karak Stone as well. The last highlight I'm going to do is with the Ushabti Bone. Now, firstly, I'm going to paint all of the runes using this Ushabti Bone. I'm also going to paint some of the wood grain as well. Not a huge amount, but just when I want to draw some attention and accentuate some of the highlights, I make sure I paint this inside the Karak Stone from the previous step. We'll paint the warpstone next, and this is probably one of the easiest parts of painting this model. It's been a little bit of an epic one so far, so I really appreciate you sticking with me. How do you feel about the new Skaven? Let me know down in the comments below if you've got any particular favourite model. So to paint the warpstone, all I'm doing is painting it with AK white. Now, you can use whatever bright white you've got. If you've got white scar, that's absolutely fine. I'm also painting it into some of the cracks that we've got across the armour, because if you look at the box art, even though there's no warpstone in there, they do still glow with it. And don't forget to do all the warpstone along the belt and also in that underneath bit around his abdomen area as well. When that's completely dry, you simply paint over all of the white using Striking Scorpion contrast paint. Now, this is a very, very bright green. It's almost lime. It's a fantastic colour. I really like how it goes over white to give a nice glow like this. If you spill any of it onto the actual metal plate itself, that's fine because it's quite translucent. It'll just look like there's a little bit of a glow on there. So work your way around all that warpstone and get this painted on. We're coming up towards the end of the model. Like I said, it's been a big one. It's been an epic one. So let's reinstate some of the fleshy areas using Pallid Witch Flesh. And generally what we're looking to do is just draw lines across some of these areas, such as the knee and the elbows, down any of the veins, and also highlighting up some of the hand area too. Now, you'll notice on the box art, the Vizzik's fingers and his teeth are those of what can be described as perhaps a smoker that has been stained with nicotine. They are a little bit yellow, a little bit disgusting. So to get this effect, we're going to take some Nasdreg yellow, and I'm going to thin this with contrast medium in a 50-50 mix. I'm then going to make sure I haven't got too much on my brush, and I'm going to start to paint this over his fingers. Now, I'm working this up towards that second knuckle, and if you need to blend it a little bit more, you can clean your brush off and just drag it back. But I want to build it up a little bit more, so as this dries, I can add more and more Nasdreg yellow till it gets me to that colour that I think matches what's on the box art. The last thing we've got to do before we put it all together is the skin wrap scabbard that is on Vizzik's belt, and to do this, I'm basing it using Rakarth Flesh. When that's completely dry, I'm going to take a little bit of Reikland Flesh shade and work this into all of the recesses. Again, it's really easy to use too much of this, so if you do that, then you just clean your brush off and paint it along the same areas, sucking up some of that wash. I'm then going to go back in with Rakarth Flesh and start to highlight those areas. Again, really important that you let it dry before you go back in. And I'm leaving very little Reikland Flesh shade on display. I'm using quite a bit of Rakarth Flesh just to go back over and cover it all. And it's worth saying that I'm going to paint the strap using Garaghak Sewr. I didn't film that bit, but I did paint the strapping using Garaghak Sewr, so it's nice and brown. The last thing to do is to take some Pallid Witch Flesh and use this to highlight all the raised edges. Now, there are quite a few, so you can get a nice bit of differentiation, a nice bit of highlighting across this area. that'll really help it stand out from all the other skin and flesh tones that we've got across the model. So stick the head on, paint the base to reflect the rest of your army, and Vizzik Skour is ready to take the battlefield and destroy the enemies of the Horned Rat. This really is a fantastic model. It has taken a while to get through him and a while to paint him, so I really hope that this video is going to help you paint yours. If you've got any questions, please do let me know down in the comments. I'll do my best to answer any and all of them. In the meantime, check out my other Skaven content here, and I will see you next time.